Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week we have all kinds of news, ranging from a detection of the new swine flu variant in the UK. We have unusual, but certainly not unsubstantiated evidence that certain amino acids might not be great for your life. A very questionable case study. Very poorly conducted research into particularly glyphosate, but pesticides in general, Nigeria approving genetically modified potatoes, and news from Mars. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with what may or may not prove to be the next pandemic. And yes, that is actually a possibility. Swine flu has been showing up in China and to a certain degree parts of Russia for quite some time now. It's largely been very intermittent and isolated cases, but they have been showing up. Those cases have nearly all been associated with individuals directly dealing with swine. This is basically pig farmers. Because of that, there hasn't been a major threat as such, simply because, well, it's kinda hard to get everybody in the world infected because not everybody in the world is a pig farmer. However, this newest instance is not so good. It's in the UK, and it wasn't an individual who was a pig farmer, and this is the problem here. The issue with swine flu is that it fundamentally follows the process of something like COVID-19. That is, an individual animal, for example a bat, becomes infected with the virus. The virus then gets transmitted to something like a pig. Because it can transmit between species, it's generally going to be more infectious. From here, it then infects a human, and now we have whatever animal it is, flu, whether it is avian influenza, swine influenza, and so on. Because it's more infectious, it spreads more quickly and therefore causes more problems. What is, let's say, worrying about this instance is that rather than being a variant like the ones in China or Russia, this is a nucleate, or a new variant of swine influenza. As a result, we now have at least 2 distinct clusters of this spreading, and now we need to figure out who's been in contact with the infected individual, whether or not they've then been infected themselves, and have they managed to pass it on. The same sort of contact tracing that occurred with COVID-19. The upside to, this particular variant, and for that matter others, is that they generally don't have the ability to spread between humans. That is, this one individual shouldn't have infected other humans, but in the instances where they do manage to infect other humans and are human-to-human transmittable, we have a much bigger issue. It's not going to lead to man-bear-pig, but it's certainly going to be problems. Problems in the form of, the next pandemic if we're unlucky, and if we're lucky, a momentary panic for the government agencies responsible for tracking and dealing with this. Going to news that is far more questionable now, and this is all about dietary advice, and specifically a dietary advice that says if you remove a particular amino acid, you will have a significantly greater lifespan, although that is only applicable if you are a mouse. Yeah. The amino acid in question is isoleucine, which is one of an essential amino acid. That is, our bodies can't produce it itself, and so we must get it from dietary sources, primarily things that are protein rich, like eggs, dairy, protein, like meats, and so on. The research on which this builds found that those who had a high isoleucine intake generally had a high BMI, but that also means that those individuals were eating a lot of food, which might explain why they weren't healthy. After all, if you are obese, you're probably not in the best of health. In fact, you're definitely not in the best of health. The mice involved are perhaps the first biggest problem, although in some ways it is more representative of humans, it is a major issue. They were genetically diverse. This means that they've basically taken a scattershot approach to see which of the genetic mutations might have an adverse interaction with various amino acids. And to be clear about this, they fed them either a diet containing all of the 20 common amino acids, or one that had a reduced amount of the isoleucine. The researchers claim that they found improvements across the board for those mice in the groups that had reduced isoleucine levels. However, what they've done is somewhat questionable. It's effectively the equivalent of a whole body scan, in that they have tried to go for just about every single measure they can reasonably achieve. This includes 26 measures of health. Yeah, this wasn't a narrowly tailored approach, this was a let's look at everything and see what shows up kind of experiment. Great for preliminary studies, terrible for this kind of claim. And of course, for the rather expected and obvious caveat to this, rodent-based studies are not going to necessarily, and in most cases do not, translate to humans. As a result, what they found may or may not have any real bearing on reality. Next, we have a similar kind of claim, although at least slightly more substantiated, related to blood pressure medication, and one in particular, and aging in animals. And we say that this is slightly better only because their claims are far less specific and certainly not as definitive. The medication in question is Rilmenidine. This is supposed to have the same effect as having a diet, at least at a cellular level. What it does is reduce energy available for cells while largely maintaining nutritional values across the board. When they have studied this in different animal models, that's pretty much what they found. The better life quality factors and measurements, but nowhere near as much of an issue in other regards. And this is certainly a strength compared to the previous study, which is purely a rodent model. Of course, there is a rather large caveat to this, and that is the actual model that this particular publication is based on. It's C. elegans, the flatworm. Now, whilst yes, it is true that some humans are certainly no more or better than your common flatworm, the vast majority of humanity is certainly not on that level, and results found within the flatworm are not going to translate to humans much better than rodents, although it is slightly superior, since they do have a large number of genetic counterparts that match our own genome, sort of. Now for a highly questionable case study, and we say highly questionable as the claims of the individual in question and the actual clinical findings don't really line up, and so arguably what's being said may just be a load of crap. The report says that a cruise passenger, a male individual, was bitten by a wolf spider, and that said wolf spider managed to lay eggs inside his toe. That toe then turned rather nasty, and eventually, well, we wind up with clinical studies. There are a number of issues with this series of events, not the least of which is, well, the wolf spider. The wolf spider itself isn't able to really penetrate through the skin, and particularly skin in the toes, where it's particularly thick, much like the passenger. The second issue is that, well, the infection within said toe doesn't open the opportunity for the eggs to be able to grow within it. It's certainly not been observed or in any other way, shape or form noted in other literature, or for that matter, studies of the wolf spider. And then finally itself is why the eggs were laid within the injury. Although arguably this is a better outcome than those British individuals who travelled to Spain and wind up with an STD. The fact that we have an infection becoming eventually somewhat pus-filled and disgusting is more indicative of penetration by something that had bacteria on it rather than a spider. Further to that, the Peruvian wolf spider, which is what the patient claims was found, is effectively a non-existent species that was identified by doctors when specialists in spiders would struggle to identify them under the most ideal of conditions, let alone being a baby spider freshly coming out of a wound covered in who knows what. Yeah, something about this says bullshit. Moving on to other bullshit studies, we have a finding, let's call it a finding, that 40% of conventional baby food products contain pesticides. Although the article itself says that toxic pesticides, toxic is a relative term and should probably not be used in the title. The study itself is interesting, let's say. largely because they looked at a surprisingly small number of products, 73, and found at least one pesticide in 22 of them, so about 1/3, hence the 40% number. What's important to this study is how much they found and how much you'd have to eat to actually get any meaningful, not even meaningful, a significant amount of, pesticide within your body. We're talking hundreds of kilograms of baby food, if not into the tons of baby food. Yeah, this is not a small amount, and even in those terms, let's assume that through some bizarre miracle, you manage to feed a baby its lifetime worth of baby food at one time without the baby exploding, much like a Monty Python sketch, you would still be well below any tolerated levels of the amount of pesticides that are allowed in them by the EPA in particular, but most regulatory bodies have a similar level of pesticide allowance. Yeah, they actually cannot get enough of this pesticide to be detected that it's realistically going to be an actual finding. There is a very good chance that what they've found is a bad reading. Not an actual finding, but such a tiny amount that it's likely contamination of the samples themselves, contamination of the devices they've used to test it, or even more likely, they've just stuffed up their study. The Guardian even manages to screw up their own, let's say, solution to this non-existent problem. They suggest buying organic baby food products, which, to be clear about it, aren't any better and in some instances are actually much worse. They aren't subjected to much stricter regulations as the Guardian claims. Instead, they're, arguably, allowed to use very specific types of chemicals. Some of them are much worse than pesticides like glyphosate, for instance. As such, you're not actually getting an improvement, you're just trading one problem for another. The fact that the Guardian is trying to sell this as something worth noting is effectively bullshit. Almost as much bullshit as the next news item, and that is vegan food, and we should probably say vegan products, as vegan food is not actually food, has decreased. This is largely being countered by an increase in the amount of meat being consumed. Vegans, that's enough said as it is, but the things they eat, and it would be a generous description to call it food, is often entirely plant-based, and that's pretty much the idea behind the diet, and nothing that is derived from animals. No eggs, no dairy, a lot of oils aren't allowed, similar sorts of issues. As such, you need to find ways to, to be blunt about it, actually be able to make food out of whatever the hell it is you're going to feed your food. One solution to this has been the, cell-cultured meat, or lab-grown meat as it's also called, but this isn't necessarily a solution in many cases, as often that is more expensive than conventionally grown meat products. At least at this rate, we'll see far fewer vegans telling us that they're vegans. After all, that's the easiest way to know that they are, and we'll see more good burger joints showing up. Shifting to other food development news, we have Nigeria's genetically modified potato project, and they've produced their results for the first year. The first year results are, unsurprisingly, superior to otherwise conventional potatoes. In fact, it's up to a 300% increase in their yield. Yeah, there are that many more potatoes out there now, and not just the ones that are shaped like a person. There is arguably a strength and a weakness to this claim. The first issue is that it was conducted across 3 different sites, so we are able to look at a reasonably strong result here in those terms. However, the 300% increase does come with a very massive caveat, and as such, probably shouldn't be taken as the degree of improvement you'll actually observe, because they're comparing it to areas where no fungicide was used, and a fungicide can be a major factor in decreasing potato yield. The issue with a fungicide is that fungicides are there to prevent late blight, and this can do one of 2 things. First of all, it can destroy the entire potato plant and tuber in the very end of its development, thereby 100% loss of potato. This would mean any 300% increase is, well, any increase at all, really. Second to that is that it does affect the potatoes in storage, and this means that you not only lose the plants in the field if you haven't harvested potatoes yet, but you also lose the potatoes in storage. This is fundamentally what the researchers found with up to 100% loss of potatoes that were used as a control, that is the non-fungicide treated potatoes. At the low end, it was about 80% loss. So you can see how they're getting 300% improvement just from that alone. The benefits of this to the farmers, to be blunt about it, cannot be overstated. The first issue is that, well, the area that it's being grown in is notorious for having massive issues with huge potato loss. That's why they lost up to 100% and at the low end 80% of all of their potatoes when we're looking at the control group. The genetically modified group, full yield. The other advantage is that it has what is effectively 2 opportunities to plant. That's because it's an early harvesting variety. Because of this, you can plant out your first crop, harvest it, and then plant out a second crop. This increases the amount of yield you can get, just based on that alone. Since there is such a massive issue with potatoes, not just from the fungus, but from being eaten by pests and other environmental factors, this will significantly, if not massively, improve food security. It will also, in theory, increase the number of potatoes that are on the couch. Bad jokes aside, let's move to, well, actually more bad jokes. We have extraterrestrial developments from Mars, and the Martian landers have found, well, bizarre geological developments, although this does come from China, so although China's astrology news is generally more reliable, we should be skeptical. The Zhurong rover has been using its ground-penetrating radar, looking at what's below the Martian surface. This is going to look at the Martian colon if it's anywhere near the butthole of Mars. What they found is very similar to wombat poop, except it's polygonal rather than cuboid. They're irregular polygonal wedges, about 35 meters. It's a reasonably large discovery if they're looking at this as a, for lack of a better word, a strip of land in which it passes through, and that they've just cut across it rather than going along its entire length. If it's 35 meters of something random, not so valuable. This could be a discovery of something very similar to the Giant's Causeway, although we're not entirely clear about exactly what it is yet, and that's because the theories are, well, kind of speculative. It's thought that they could be from freeze-thaw cycles on Mars, or from cooling lava flows from volcanoes. It's kind of up in the air, although we are disappointed that nobody did propose the giants had built the causeway itself again. Martian giants could be at least more entertaining. The useful results from this are rather more pragmatic, and that is, it's evidence of not just moving water, but moving water that would freeze. This meant that there had to be at least some kind of seasonal, if not seasonal, at least a significant enough change in temperatures across the planet to create these. There are also other possible explanations, such as water moving from aquifers or into aquifers. This gives us better evidence, and more arguably growing evidence, of not only water, but moving water on Mars. That water was significantly, and we mean massively, altered by some sort of climatic upheaval, and that's why we're observing these changes at the depth we are. Rather than just being a seemingly random change, the level they're at, about 35 meters, would indicate that there was a big transformation in the water activity on the planet quite some time ago, arguably ancient Martian times, but since we don't know much about the ancient Martians, we can only say a long time ago. That is what would have caused this, whether it is due to lava flows or water changes. Either way, the results are the same, it's just we don't know when exactly or how exactly it happened. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.